She returned home with her father's compass, then uncovered the harbor's darkest secret. Mara Doyle stepped off the ferry at Hallow's Point with a single suitcase and a heart full of dread. The salty wind hit her face, the way it always had, but nothing else about the town felt the same. 20 years had passed since she last walked these docks, and now she was back only because her mother had died. The funeral was small, a handful of neighbors, a tired priest, and the constant creak of old boats rocking against the pier outside the church windows. Mara stood at the front, dressed in black, feeling like a stranger in the place she once called home. After the service, people offered quiet condolences and quick hugs, but their eyes did not quite meet hers. She told herself it was grief making her imagine things. She was wrong. That evening, Mara sat alone in her mother's small house at the edge of town, going through boxes of old letters, photographs, and clothes. The house smelled of dust and salt, the same smell she remembered from childhood. In the back of her mother's closet, behind a stack of folded quilts, she found a wooden box she did not recognize. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a brass compass. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this compass. It had belonged to her father, Daniel Doyle, a lobster boat captain who vanished at sea when Mara was 12 years old. She remembered him showing it to her on the porch, telling her that a compass never lies, even when the sea tries to confuse you. After his boat was found empty, drifting near the rocks one foggy morning, everyone said the compass must have gone down with him. It had been part of the story for 20 years. A piece of him lost forever. But here it was, in her mother's closet, hidden away like a secret. Mara turned the compass over in her hands. On the inside of the metal case, she noticed faint scratches, almost like writing. She carried it to the lamp and looked closer. Someone had carved a date into the metal, a date nearly 6 months after her father's boat was found empty. Her hands began to shake. If the compass had been with him on his final voyage, how could someone have carved a date into it 6 months later? Mara did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the compass in front of her, turning the question over and over in her mind. Maybe the date meant nothing. Maybe it was a mistake, or a coincidence, but something deep inside her refused to believe that. The next morning, she walked down to the harbor for the first time in 20 years. The fishing boats looked smaller than she remembered, their paint peeling, their nets patched many times over. A few old fishermen sat near the docks, mending lines and smoking pipes. She recognized one of them, a weathered man named Old Tom, who used to work with her father. "Tom," she said carefully, "do you remember my father, Daniel Doyle?" The old man's hands stopped moving. He looked up at her slowly, his eyes guarded. "Course I remember Danny," he said. "Good man. Terrible thing. What happened?" "I found his compass," Mara said, "in my mother's closet. There's a date carved into it. Months after he disappeared." Tom's face changed, just for a second, before he composed himself again. "Compasses get passed around the harbor all the time," he said. "Could have been a mix-up." But Mara noticed his hands were trembling as he picked up his fishing line again. He would not look at her after that. Over the next few days, Mara found the same strange reaction wherever she went. The grocery store owner changed the subject quickly when she mentioned her father. The woman at the post office suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. Even the harbor master, a stern man named Walter Briggs who had run the docks for as long as anyone could remember, grew cold and short with her the moment she brought up her father's name. "Your father's accident was a long time ago," Briggs said, not meeting her eyes. "Best to let the dead rest, Miss Doyle." But Mara could not let it rest. Something about the way everyone avoided her questions told her there was more to the story than a simple accident at sea. She decided to stay in Hallow's Point a little longer than planned. She told her boss at the insurance company she needed extra time to settle her mother's affairs, which was true, but it was not the whole truth. She wanted answers. Mara began going through her mother's old papers more carefully. Tucked behind a loose floorboard in her childhood bedroom, she found something she never expected. A small leather logbook, its pages yellowed and brittle, written in her father's familiar handwriting. She sat on the floor of her old room and read through the pages with her heart pounding. The early entries were simple records of fishing trips, weather conditions, and catch totals, but the later entries told a different story. Her father had written about strange boats arriving at the harbor late at night, boats that did not belong to anyone in town. He wrote about numbers in the fishing co-op's books that did not add up, about boats that were reported lost at sea for insurance money, even though no one ever saw them sink. He wrote about a growing uneasy feeling that something illegal was happening right under the town's nose, hidden behind the everyday business of fishing. The final entry in the logbook was dated just 3 days before his boat was found empty. In it, her father wrote that he had gathered enough proof and planned to go to the authorities. He named names, people Mara had grown up trusting, people who had hugged her at family gatherings and waved to her on the street. Mara closed the logbook, her hands cold despite the warm evening air. Her father had not vanished by accident. He had uncovered something dangerous, and 3 days later, he disappeared. She thought of old Tom's trembling hands. She thought of Walter Briggs' cold eyes. She thought of the compass with its impossible date. Someone in this town knew the truth about what happened to her father, and they had spent 20 years making sure no one found out. Mara needed to be careful. She made copies of the logbook pages and hid the original in a safe place. She began asking quiet questions, careful not to reveal how much she already knew. She visited the local newspaper archive and read old articles about her father's disappearance, noting how quickly the investigation had been closed. She visited the county records office and found strange gaps in the harbor's official documents from that year, pages that seemed to be missing entirely. One evening, as she walked back to her mother's house after a long day of searching, she noticed her car tires had been slashed. A simple note was tucked under the windshield wiper. It read only, "Stop asking questions." Mara's hands shook as she read the note, but she did not feel fear so much as anger. Someone wanted her to be afraid. Someone wanted her to leave Hallow's Point and forget about her father, just like everyone else had been forced to forget. She thought about going to the police, but she did not know who in town she could trust. Instead, she went to see the one person who had always been kind to her, who had never once changed the subject when she asked about her father. Her uncle, Frank Doyle, her father's younger brother, who had helped raise her after her father disappeared, and had been like a second father to her ever since. Frank lived in a small cottage near the edge of town, where he had lived alone since his wife passed away years before. When Mara arrived, he welcomed her warmly, the way he always had, with a strong hug and a kettle already on the stove. "You look tired, sweetheart," Frank said, studying her face. "What's going on?" Mara hesitated, but she trusted Frank more than anyone else in Hallow's Point. She told him everything: the compass, the strange date, the logbook hidden in the floorboard, the slashed tires and the warning note. She watched Frank's face carefully as she spoke, expecting concern, maybe even fear for her safety. Instead, she saw something else, something that made her stomach turn cold. Frank's face did not show surprise. It showed guilt. "Frank," she said slowly, "you knew, didn't you? You knew the whole time." For a long moment, Frank said nothing. He stared down at his hands, the same hands that had taught her to ride a bike, that had walked her down the aisle when she got married years ago, before that marriage quietly ended. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "Your father found out things he shouldn't have," Frank said. "Things that would have destroyed this town. The fishing co-op, the insurance fraud. All of it was keeping half the families in Hallow's Point afloat, even if it wasn't honest. If your father had gone to the authorities, the whole harbor would have shut down. Hundreds of people would have lost everything. So they decided to make him disappear instead," Mara said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did," Frank said quickly. "There was an argument out on the water. Things got out of hand. I wasn't there, Mara. I swear to you I wasn't there. But afterward, the others came to me. They said if the truth came out, it would destroy everything, including you. They said it was better for everyone to believe it was an accident." "And you agreed," Mara said. "You helped them hide it." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "I kept his compass," he said softly. "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, and I couldn't bring myself to give it back to your mother either, not without explaining everything. I gave it to her years later, after enough time had passed, telling her I found it among old fishing supplies. I thought maybe, somehow, it would bring her peace. I am sorry, Mara. I have carried this guilt for 20 years. Mara sat in silence, feelings of grief and anger swirling inside her. The man in front of her was not a monster. He was someone who had made a terrible choice out of fear and loyalty to a town that could not survive without its harbor. But he had also helped bury the truth about her father's fate, and he had let her grow up not knowing what really happened. "I have to go to the authorities," Mara said finally. "I can't keep this secret the way you did." Frank nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "I know," he said. "Part of me has been waiting 20 years for someone to finally make me tell the truth." The following weeks were difficult for Hallow's Point. Mara brought the logbook and her findings to federal investigators, who began a thorough inquiry into the fishing co-op's records and the strange pattern of lost boats and insurance claims stretching back decades. Several prominent men in town, including Walter Briggs, were questioned and eventually faced serious consequences for their role in the fraud and cover-up. Frank cooperated fully with investigators, accepting responsibility for his part in hiding the truth, even though he always maintained he had no part in what happened to Daniel Doyle out on the water that night. The town was shaken. Some residents were angry at Mara for bringing trouble to their doors after so many quiet years. Others, quietly, thanked her for finally giving them the truth they had long suspected, but were too afraid to seek themselves. The harbor's economy struggled in the aftermath, but slowly, honest fishing businesses began to take root again, free from the shadow of fraud that had hung over the docks for so long. As for what exactly happened to her father on his final night at sea, the full truth was never completely uncovered. The men involved in the argument that night either refused to speak or claimed they did not remember the details clearly enough to give a full account. Mara had to accept that some questions might never have perfect answers, and that the compass in her hands was perhaps the closest thing to closure she would ever receive. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, Mara walked down to the harbor one last time before returning to her own life away from Hallow's Point. She stood at the edge of the dock, watching the sun sink low over the water, the same water that had taken her father from her so many years before. She opened her hand and looked down at the brass compass resting in her palm. It had been the beginning of everything, the small object that cracked open 20 years of silence. She thought about her father's words from so long ago, that a compass never lies, even when the sea tries to confuse you. Mara finally understood what those words truly meant. The truth had been waiting all along, hidden beneath the surface, just like the secrets of the harbor itself. It had taken her father's compass, and her own quiet determination, to finally bring it into the light. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Mara slipped the compass into her coat pocket and turned to walk home, carrying with her, at last, the peace she had been searching for since she was 12 years old.